In a world where the weak are told to kneel, where hunger and war are used as weapons, one small nation dared to rise. Burkina Faso, a country dismissed as powerless, forgotten by history, cornered by sanctions and betrayal. And yet, in its darkest hour, something happened that shocked the world. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, this land of dust and struggle chose not to bow, but to fight, to endure, and to rise against all odds. This is the story of how Burkina Faso entered the war race, and how one man's defiance set fire to an entire continent. If you like this video, then like, share, and subscribe. The world was already on fire. Nations poured billions into weapons, drones filled the skies of distant continents, and armies swelled in size as if preparing for a war no one could avoid. And yet, in the heart of West Africa, a landlocked nation stood at the edge of erasure, Burkina Faso. A country scarred by poverty, strangled by embargoes, and torn apart by violence. A place where children starved in silence, where villages were erased overnight by rebel raids, and where the cries of widows and mothers echoed louder than any anthem. And at the center of this storm stood one man, Ibrahim Traoré. Young, defiant, unbroken. He was no ordinary leader. He did not inherit power. He seized it, not for glory, but for survival. Yet survival itself had become a luxury, because a choice had been forced upon him. The ultimatum came not from his people, but from the shadows beyond Africa. Foreign powers whispered behind polished walls in distant capitals, "Stay weak, stay dependent, or prepare for war." Burkina Faso was not meant to rise. It was meant to remain chained, exporting gold, cotton, and labor while importing fear and famine. But Traoré saw what others refused to admit. The world had entered a war race, and his nation was being pushed to the starting line. The borders were already bleeding. Mercenaries, funded from abroad, slipped silently into villages, torching homes and massacring families. Drones hovered in the skies, gathering intelligence not for Burkina Faso, but against it. Neighboring armies bristled with weapons supplied by foreign sponsors. And inside his own capital, whispers of betrayal spread through the ranks of his generals. The message was clear. Burkina Faso was not safe. Not its people, not its borders, not its future. For a soldier-turned-leader like Traoré, this was no longer politics. This was survival. If he stayed silent, the nation would dissolve. If he bowed, the chains would tighten. If he fought, the world would turn against him. And yet, in the stillness of the night, surrounded by hunger and despair, Traoré made a choice that would ignite history. He refused to surrender. He refused to let Burkina Faso be erased. Instead, he would do the unthinkable. He would drag his battered, starving nation into the war race. He would transform weakness into defiance, despair into resilience. He would build not just an army but a movement, one that could terrify enemies and inspire Africa. The stakes were unbearable. His people had nothing left to lose. And so, on that day, Ibrahim Traoré began a journey that would turn Burkina Faso into a name feared in war rooms across the world. What he did next would not only shake Africa, it would terrify the world. Burkina Faso was a nation carved from struggle. Its soil was rich, yet its people starved. Beneath its surface lay veins of gold and minerals worth billions, yet its villages were painted with hunger. For decades, foreign companies had mined its wealth, carting away fortunes while leaving behind nothing but empty pits and poisoned rivers. The capital, Ouagadougou, was both the heart of the country and its wound. Markets overflowed with dust instead of food. Mothers lined up for hours under a blistering sun, holding tin bowls in the hope of rice handouts. Fathers walked miles, desperate for work, only to return at night with empty hands. Children carried notebooks but no pencils, learning in schools where the ceiling leaked and desks were missing. The nation was bleeding from within, and at its borders, the bleeding was worse. Insurgents stalked the north and east, seizing villages, recruiting boys at gunpoint and tearing apart families. Every week there were funerals, wooden coffins covered in cloth, women wailing, priests whispering prayers over graves that never stopped multiplying. But even in the chaos, there was a shadow darker than the rebels themselves, the slow chokehold of foreign control. The International Monetary Fund demanded austerity. Burkina Faso owed billions in debt, loans it never truly received, loans signed by past leaders who traded the future of their people for foreign approval. Every month payments were due, and every month gold shipments left the country escorted under foreign flags, destined for vaults in Europe and Asia. The people saw their wealth vanish, yet their hunger grew. And above it all, the war race had begun. Around the world, nations were building weapons faster than they built schools. Armies expanded, research in artificial intelligence and drone warfare surged, and global defense budgets swelled into trillions. Africa, too, was being pulled into the tide. In the east, Ethiopia and Eritrea stockpiled artillery. In the north, Egypt flexed its military muscle. West Africa, long dismissed as weak and fragmented, was suddenly a battlefield for influence. France, Russia, China, America, all placed their bets, arming factions and backing leaders who bent to their will. But in Ouagadougou, a new voice had risen, Ibrahim Traoré. He had been a soldier, hardened by desert heat and the silence of war. He had seen comrades fall, villages destroyed, and promises broken by leaders who served not the people, but their foreign masters. When he seized power, many expected him to bow like the rest, to follow orders, to keep Burkina Faso weak. But Traoré was different. He spoke of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once dreamed of an Africa free from chains. Sankara had been assassinated before his dream could bloom, but his spirit haunted the land, carried in whispers by the old and in songs sung by the young. Traoré embraced that spirit not as memory, but as destiny. Still, ideals could not feed the hungry. Speeches could not stop bullets. And for every dream he carried, there were enemies plotting in silence. Inside the barracks, 3 generals watched him with cold eyes. They had grown fat under the old system, feeding off corruption, arms deals, and foreign favors. To them, Traoré's defiance was dangerous, his vision a threat. He was too young, too bold, too unwilling to compromise. In secret meetings, they whispered of removing him. A coup, a swift strike, and the old order would return. But Traoré knew. He felt the ground shifting beneath him. He saw the hunger in his people, the betrayals brewing in his army, and the encirclement of his borders. Burkina Faso was cornered, and cornered nations had only 2 choices: surrender or fight. The world believed Traoré would surrender. After all, what could a small, landlocked country with a collapsing economy and a fractured army possibly do in the war race of giants? But the world underestimated one thing: the will of a people who had nothing left to lose. In villages where children starved, there was no fear left of dying. In towns scarred by rebel attacks, grief had hardened into rage. In the army, young soldiers looked at Traoré not as a politician, but as one of their own. A man who had bled beside them in the desert, who ate from the same rations, who buried friends with his own hands, and so quietly he began to prepare. First, he cut the strings of dependency. He refused IMF orders, declaring that Burkina Faso's gold would stay in Africa. He froze contracts with foreign mining companies, sparking outrage in European capitals. He reached out to neighboring nations, seeking alliances not with the old powers, but with fellow Africans who shared the scars of colonial exploitation. Next, he turned to the military. He called for the reorganization of the army, rooting out officers whose loyalty was tied to foreign money. He spoke to soldiers directly, bypassing chains of command, promising them not riches, but honor. He vowed that no Burkinabe would die, in vain that their fight would not be for foreign interests but for the soil beneath their feet. Weapons, however, were scarce. Burkina Faso could not match the arsenals of greater powers, but Traoré had studied modern war. He knew that victory was not always found in strength, but in innovation. He began seeking new strategies: asymmetric warfare, drone defenses, localized manufacturing. If the world was racing toward war, Burkina Faso would not run in the same lane. It would carve its own. Yet even as he prepared, the walls closed in. Sanctions followed. Aid was cut. Western leaders condemned him as reckless, dangerous, unstable. News outlets painted him as a dictator, a risk to stability. The generals tightened their circles, plotting, waiting for the moment to strike. Rebels grew bolder, believing that the young leader would fall. But in the streets, something strange began to happen. The people, beaten down by decades of despair, began to rise. Farmers brought food to soldiers. Students painted murals of Sankara and Traoré side by side. Mothers carried water to military camps. Old men told stories of resistance around fire pits. A whisper spread across the land. Maybe this time is different. Burkina Faso was awakening, and Ibrahim Traoré knew the awakening would soon collide with fire. The night skies over Ouagadougou grew restless. Drones, foreign-made, buzzed faintly overhead. Satellites mapped every street, every movement. In a world driven by surveillance, even shadows were watched. Traoré understood this. His every step, every decree was monitored not only by his own people but by capitals thousands of miles away. He was a young soldier in a chess game where the board spanned continents and the opponents were nations armed with endless resources. But he also knew that desperation could breed brilliance, and so in silence, he built. In the countryside, abandoned warehouses were transformed into secret workshops. Skilled hands, once used for mining and farming, now turned to forging weapons and assembling drones from salvaged parts. Mechanics, engineers and students, people overlooked for generations, became soldiers of innovation. In their eyes, this was not just war preparation. It was dignity reclaimed. At the same time, Traoré moved to forge alliances, not with the predictable giants, but with the neighbors who understood hardship. Mali, still fractured but defiant, listened. Niger, suffocating under its own sanctions, leaned closer. The Sahel was tired of being a playground for foreign powers, tired of debt chains and proxy wars. Quietly, meetings were held under the cover of night. Pacts were written not on paper but in trust and necessity, and from the east came whispers. Sudan, embroiled in its own conflict, sent signals of solidarity. From across the Sahara, Libya's fractured militias offered contacts, smugglers, and old Soviet weapons hidden in desert bunkers. Even whispers of Russia and China circled, not out of altruism but strategy. Great powers always smelled opportunity where chaos brewed. Still, Traoré tread carefully. Too much reliance on outsiders, and Burkina Faso would simply trade one master for another. His vision was radical, not dependency, but sovereignty, a Burkina Faso that would stand alone if it had to. Meanwhile, inside the army, the storm brewed, louder. The three generals who despised him tightened their grip. They sabotaged orders, delayed supplies, whispered poison among the ranks. To them, Traoré's reforms were a threat to decades of privilege. They saw him not as a savior of the people, but as a reckless gambler dragging the nation into a war it could not win. They were not wrong about the danger, but what they could not see was the fire burning among the people. In the villages, hunger did not break spirits, it sharpened them. Farmers spoke of picking up arms. Women formed networks to smuggle food to soldiers. Students volunteered to patrol at night, unarmed but unafraid. The people were preparing for something far greater than defense. They were preparing for survival, and survival had become war. The IMF's sanctions bit harder each week. Banks froze accounts. Trade collapsed. Fuel grew scarce. Black markets thrived where the state faltered. But instead of crushing Traoré, the pressure steeled him. Each sanction was proof that his defiance rattled the world. Each embargo was fuel for his narrative, that Burkina Faso had been chosen not for its weakness but for its potential strength. Still, he was no fool. He knew that Burkina Faso could not match the global war race in numbers, weapons, or technology. To survive, he needed something different, a doctrine that would make the world pause before striking. And so he returned to history. The guerrilla wars of Vietnam, the defiance of Cuba, the strategies of Sankara, who once mobilized an entire people with nothing but vision and will. From these lessons, Traoré began to craft a new military philosophy. It was not about overwhelming firepower, but about resilience, unpredictability, and unity between army and people. In training camps, soldiers drilled not just with rifles, but with endurance, learning to fight with little, to adapt, to vanish into the land itself. Drones patrolled skies, crude yet effective. Militias formed village by village, a nation arming itself in fragments that together became whole. And for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso began to feel like it was not waiting to be saved. It was preparing to save itself. But the cost was immense. Children went to bed hungry. Soldiers fought without pay. Families gave what little they had, knowing it might never return. The air grew heavier with each passing day, as if the land itself knew that something irreversible was coming. The generals plotted still, convinced that Traoré would soon fall, either by foreign pressure, by rebellion, or by their own coup. They could not imagine a Burkina Faso strong enough to survive the storm. But beyond the barracks and beyond the palaces, in the dusty fields and crowded markets, the people whispered a different belief. That this was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. That this was about Africa. Traoré's defiance was not contained within borders. It spread, carried by radio, by whispers, by the internet. In Ghana, students shared his speeches. In Senegal, youth painted his face on walls. In Nigeria, activists debated whether the time had come to throw off foreign chains. And so, what began as the survival of one small nation began to feel like the spark of something larger. The war race was no longer a distant contest between superpowers. It was here. It was African. And Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, was about to join. The storm broke not with bullets, but with hunger. By the time the third round of IMF sanctions arrived, Burkina Faso's shelves were bare. Rice vanished. Wheat tripled in price. Families waited in endless lines for a handful of flour, only to be turned away by soldiers guarding empty warehouses. Mothers wept at the silence of their children's hunger. Fathers walked for days in search of food, only to return with nothing but shame. The sanctions were designed to break Traoré, to force him to his knees. But instead, they broke the illusion that Burkina Faso could survive by bending. In every corner of the nation, the people saw it. Submission meant starvation. Resistance meant risk. But at least resistance promised dignity. And so, despair became defiance. In the capital, young men built barricades on streets. In villages, women formed circles of resistance, smuggling food past checkpoints, defying curfews. Farmers, though robbed of their harvest by middlemen and traders, began hiding grain for militias. Every sanction that squeezed them pushed them closer to Traoré's vision. But not everyone shared his resolve. Inside the army, cracks widened. Soldiers, unpaid and exhausted, began to question. Some muttered that the IMF was too powerful, that the West could crush them in days if it chose. Others whispered that Traoré was sacrificing the nation for his pride. It was in this moment of doubt that the three generals moved. They had been waiting. They had been watching. Their plan was subtle, not a coup, not yet, but sabotage. Weapons. Shipments meant for the front lines were mysteriously delayed. Patrol routes were leaked to foreign intelligence. Entire villages were left undefended, left to burn under rebel raids. And always, the generals whispered in shadows, promising officers that once Traoré fell, life would return to comfort. But Traoré was not blind. He saw the hesitation in his soldiers' eyes, the missing supplies, the betrayals that could not be explained by chance. He knew the knife was already at his back, yet he did not strike prematurely. He let them plot, let them tighten their circle. For if he crushed them too soon, another would rise. But if he exposed them at the moment of greatest pressure, when the nation teetered, then their downfall would be undeniable. While his enemies conspired, Traoré prepared for the inevitable escalation. Workshops across the country churned day and night. Crude drones lifted into skies, shaky, fragile, but real. Engineers built armored trucks from scrap metal, welding steel plates onto civilian vehicles. Farmers delivered fuel hidden in sacks of grain. What they lacked in polish, they replaced with determination. The first test came on the northern frontier. A convoy of rebels supplied with foreign weapons moved against a farming town. The army, stretched thin, could not respond in time. But Traoré ordered the new drones deployed, untested, unready. In the night sky, villagers heard the buzz of wings overhead. Crude bombs fell, scattering the convoy. It was not decisive, but it was enough. For the first time in memory, rebels fled instead of advanced. Word spread like fire. Burkina Faso had built its own weapons. Burkina Faso had fought back and won. It was a small victory, almost insignificant on a global scale. But to a starving, sanctioned nation, it was everything. It proved that survival was not just a dream, it was possible. Yet the world noticed too. Western capitals tightened their grip, announcing harsher embargoes. No aid, no medicine, no fuel. The message was clear. Burkina Faso was to be punished for daring to resist. And still, Traoré did not yield. Instead, he took the boldest step yet. He announced, in a speech carried across Africa, that Burkina Faso would join the new war race, not as a puppet, not as a proxy, but as a sovereign force, one that would arm itself, defend itself, and inspire others to do the same. His words lit fires across the continent. In Mali, crowds cheered in the streets. In Niger, soldiers raised fists. In Senegal, students whispered, "If Burkina Faso can fight, why not us?" But inside his own walls, the knives grew sharper. The three generals seethed. To them, Traoré had crossed the line. He was no longer a nuisance, he was a threat to everything they had built, everything they had stolen, everything they had promised their foreign allies. And so, they prepared for their boldest betrayal yet. The betrayal came not with a gunshot, but with silence. On a dry morning in Ouagadougou, 3 supply convoys meant to bring fuel and rations to the northern front lines, simply never arrived. Dozens of soldiers stranded without food abandoned their posts. Villages were left undefended. Rebels advanced unchallenged, torching homes, slaughtering livestock, and dragging survivors away. The news struck the capital like a lightning bolt. People began to whisper. Had Traoré lost control of his army? Were his promises of strength an illusion? Behind the walls of power, the truth was clear. The missing convoys were no accident. The 3 generals had tightened their grip. They had sabotaged the war effort to humiliate him, to show that his dream of resistance was doomed, and in the shadows they prepared for the final blow, a quiet coup. But Traoré was not a man who waited for death. That same night, he summoned his most loyal commanders. In a candlelit room, maps spread across the table, he pointed to the depots where the generals hoarded supplies, to the barracks where their loyalists gathered. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of history. If they wished to betray us, then let their betrayal be their end. The plan was brutal, precise. His loyalists would strike the generals before dawn. But as the hour approached, an unexpected twist struck. A junior officer, torn between loyalty to his commander and whispers from the generals, fled into the night, carrying word of Traoré's plan. By the time the first loyalist unit moved, the generals were already waiting. The capital descended into chaos. Gunfire rattled through the streets. Soldiers turned on soldiers. Barricades went up across neighborhoods. For ordinary citizens, It was terror. Men in uniform bursting into homes, searching for traitors, dragging suspected spies into the streets. For Traoré, it was the moment of truth. He could not hide. He could not retreat. And so, while his enemies huddled in fortified compounds, Traoré walked into the streets. No guards, no armor, only the green uniform that had become a symbol. The people saw him and surged forward. Women shouted his name, children clung to his legs, men raised fists. In a single night of chaos, Traoré turned panic into defiance. The generals had soldiers, but Traoré had a nation. His loyalists, now reinforced by angry citizens, moved like wildfire. Depots were raided, ammunition redistributed, convoys seized, back. In one decisive strike, rebels of the north who had been advancing suddenly faced unexpected resistance. Villagers armed not with rifles, but with crude drones and stolen trucks. And when the smoke cleared in the capital, only one truth remained. The generals had failed. Their plan to fracture Burkina Faso had instead united it. Some fled across borders. Others were captured, dragged before the very citizens they had betrayed. For the first time in decades, the people themselves decided the fate of their oppressors. But victory came at a cost. The fighting left hundreds dead in the capital, thousands displaced. The army, already thin, was now fractured. Supplies were even scarcer, and on the horizon the great powers of the world sharpened their knives. Burkina Faso had declared itself ready to enter the war race, and the response was merciless. Satellite images confirmed it. Foreign drones were circling above the Sahel. Convoys of mercenaries poured into neighboring states, their eyes fixed on Traoré's fragile uprising. The IMF announced that any nation trading with Burkina Faso would face sanctions, and diplomats whispered of interventions, not peacekeeping, but punishment. The weight of the world now pressed on a single man. Yet in that crucible of despair, something remarkable happened. Across Africa, the spark caught fire. In Bamako, youth carried banners declaring, "We are Burkina Faso." In Niamey, soldiers painted Traoré's name on armored vehicles. Even in Dakar, long thought a Western stronghold, students marched, chanting for freedom. Burkina Faso was no longer alone. It was the first domino, and Traoré knew it. He gathered his nation once more, this time not in whispers, but in a fiery speech broadcast under a blood-red sunset. His voice, raw and unpolished, carried across radios and broken televisions. "We are hungry, we are tired, but we are not broken. They think our size is our weakness, but it is our strength. We have nothing left to lose, and a people with nothing to lose cannot be defeated." The crowd roared. Farmers, students, mothers, soldiers, all raised their voices. For the first time, the world saw not a starving nation, but a mobilizing one. And in the smoke of rebellion, the war race had truly begun, not of tanks and jets alone, but of ideas. A race between submission and defiance, between chains and freedom. A race in which Traoré, battered but unbroken, had placed Burkina Faso at the front. But deep in his heart, he knew the next act would decide everything. The sanctions were tightening. The foreign mercenaries were coming. His army was bleeding. His people were starving. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could resist. It was whether it could survive the firestorm that was about to descend. The sky above Ouagadougou was no longer free. Foreign drones circled in silence, their cameras peering down at every street, every convoy, every heartbeat of the capital. Day and night the city lived under their shadow. Children pointed at the sky with fear. Mothers hushed them, pulling them indoors. The war race had arrived, not as a distant threat, but as an iron fist pressing on the chest of Burkina Faso, and then came the mercenaries. At dawn, convoys of armored trucks rolled across the borders, painted in no flag but known by all. They were ghosts of past wars, soldiers of fortune, men who had once fought in Libya, Sierra Leone, Mali. They answered, not to governments but to money, and the money behind them was endless. Burkina Faso was the smallest target they had ever faced, but this time, the smallest target had a lion at its heart. Traoré watched from the presidential compound as reports flooded in. Villages torched in the east, checkpoints destroyed in the north, refugees pouring toward the capital. His commanders pleaded for caution. His advisors whispered surrender. Even the few diplomats who dared to meet him said the same thing. You cannot fight the world. But Traoré did not speak of surrender. He spoke of survival, and survival demanded the unthinkable. In a secret warehouse on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, engineers worked by candlelight on crude weapons of war, drones patched together from civilian parts, armored trucks refitted with steel plates ripped from abandoned factories, homemade rockets unstable but deadly. It was not an army by Western standards. It was desperation turned into steel, and in that desperation lay their strength. The mercenaries struck first. In the northern desert town of Djibo, they surrounded the garrison. For 3 days, the defenders held out. By the 4th, they were starving. By the 5th, the mercenaries stormed in, leaving nothing but ash. The message was clear: resist, and you will be erased. Traoré knew the next target would be the capital. On a sweltering afternoon, as the sun hung low, the drones descended. Explosions ripped through the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Fuel depots, communications towers, bridges, all shattered in fire. Panic spread like smoke. The city was cut off, choking under its own fear. And still, Traoré stood. In the courtyard of the compound, he gathered his soldiers, his engineers, his farmers, his mothers and children. Thousands had come, not with weapons but with bare hands, with sticks, with anything they could hold. The air was thick with dust and sweat, with fear and defiance. And then he spoke. They think we are weak because we are poor. They think our hunger makes us slaves. They think our size makes us easy prey, but tell me, he raised his voice, shaking the courtyard, what do you call a people who have nothing left to lose? The roar was deafening. From the rooftops, women screamed his name. From the ground, men pounded fists on their chests. Even children cried out. The city itself seemed to rise. When the mercenaries pushed toward the capital, they did not face an army. They faced a nation. Roads were barricaded with burning tires and overturned buses. Drones were swarmed by flocks of birds released by villagers, a crude trick that blinded their cameras. Convoys were lured into narrow alleys where firebombs rained from rooftops. For every rifle the mercenaries had, Traoré's people had 1,000 stones. For every drone, 1,000 prayers. And slowly, impossibly, the tide turned. By nightfall, the mercenaries had expected to drink victory. Instead, they bled retreat. Streets were littered with burning wrecks of armored trucks, their shadows dancing against the flames, and in the smoke stood the figure of Traoré, dusty, unyielding, more symbol than man. But this was no victory. Burkina Faso had survived the assault, but barely. Hundreds lay dead, thousands wounded. The city was scarred. Supplies were gone. And the enemy had not been defeated and only delayed, and then the message came. A broadcast, not from Ouagadougou, not from Africa, but from the halls of power across the ocean. A voice, cold and clear, declaring that Burkina Faso would face total isolation. No trade, no aid, no medicine. Any nation daring to stand with, it would be punished. The people listened in silence. Mothers clutched starving children. Fathers clenched fists. Soldiers lowered their eyes. It was the heaviest blow yet, a sentence not of bullets but of hunger. Yet in that silence, Traoré rose once more. They will starve us. They will burn us. They will bury us. But hear me. If Burkina Faso must die, it will die standing. And in our death, Africa will rise. The words carried beyond borders, into Mali, into Niger, into Ghana, into the hearts of millions who had waited, suffered, dreamed. The mercenaries had failed to crush him. The sanctions would try. But the people now believed, not just in Traoré, but in themselves. And so, the climax was not a single battle. It was a firestorm of bombs, of betrayals, of starvation, of defiance. By the end of that firestorm, Burkina Faso stood bloodied, gasping, but unbroken, and the world, watching in disbelief, began to whisper a question it had never asked before. What if this tiny nation truly lit the fuse of Africa's freedom? The war drums faded, but their echo lingered across Burkina Faso. In Ouagadougou, the smoke still rose from broken streets. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to blackened shells. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, their halls lit only by flickering candles because the power grids had been bombed into silence. Mothers sat on the ground cradling their children, whispering lullabies against the hunger gnawing at their bellies. Fathers searched the ruins for food, for medicine, for hope. The people had survived the assault, but survival was a hollow word. The embargo had arrived like an invisible cage. Ships that once carried rice and grain no longer docked at West African ports. Trucks that once delivered medicine stopped at closed borders. Farmers tried to grow what they could, but drought had dried the rivers into cracked veins in the earth. Every corner of life felt suffocated by an unseen hand. The world expected silence, expected this small nation to collapse under the weight of hunger. But instead, silence turned to defiance. Across the markets of Ouagadougou, women began trading in secret. Dried roots, wild herbs, scraps of grain, passed from hand to hand when no one was watching. Children carried messages between villages, dodging patrols and drones. Blacksmiths reforged scraps of metal into tools and weapons. Engineers rigged car batteries into makeshift generators to power clinics for just a few precious hours. It was not enough, but it was survival. And in the center of it stood Ibrahim Traoré. He did not retreat into palaces or shelters. He walked through the ruins with the people. He carried bags of grain on his shoulders. He sat in hospitals, holding the hands of the dying. He slept on the same mats as soldiers, ate the same scraps as orphans. He became more than a leader. He became a symbol, the face of a nation refusing to break. News of this spread like wildfire even through the blockade. In Bamako, crowds gathered in the streets chanting his name. In Niamey, students painted murals of him on school walls. In Dakar, musicians wrote songs comparing him to Sankara, to Lumumba, to Nkrumah. Across the continent, a forgotten fire reignited. Africa began to rise, not with guns, not with armies, but with voices, with marches, with resistance. Thousands took to the streets in cities far from Burkina Faso, waving homemade flags, demanding their leaders break free from the wise chains of foreign powers. What had begun as one nation's struggle began to spread like cracks across a glass empire. But for Traoré, the price was still unbearable. He buried his soldiers with his own hands. He wept with mothers who had lost everything. At night, when the chants faded and the fires died down, he stood alone on the roof of the compound staring at the stars, asking the same question again and again. Was this sacrifice worth it? And then came the answer, not from the heavens, but from his people. One morning, as the sun broke over the battered city, thousands gathered outside the compound gates. Men, women, and children stood in silence, holding nothing but sticks and scraps of cloth. Slowly, one by one, they raised them high, forming a sea of makeshift flags, each stitched with the colors of Burkina Faso. No words, no chants, just silent defiance. Traoré stepped onto the balcony, his eyes heavy, his body weary. But when he saw them, when he saw that sea of flags, that unbreakable spirit, his shoulders straightened. His voice carried like thunder across the square. We are not starving in vain. We are not suffering in vain. We are proving to the world that Africa's chains can be broken. If we endure today, tomorrow will belong to us all. The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in unity. For the first time, hope felt stronger than despair. And it was not just hope, it was action. In Mali, Convoys of grain began to cross secretly into Burkina Faso. In Niger, soldiers defected from foreign alliances to join the Burkinabe cause. In Ghana, workers sabotaged foreign-owned mines, demanding control of their own resources. The blockade was still there, but its grip was weakening. Africa was moving. The world's great powers looked on in disbelief. What was meant to be an example of punishment had become a beacon of resistance. The poorest country in the war race had defied every prediction. It had not won, not yet, but it had not lost. And in its survival, it had ignited something far greater than itself. Burkina Faso stood bruised, starving, scarred. But it stood. And Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as a young, inexperienced captain, now walked as a giant in history. He was not merely the leader of Burkina Faso. He was the spark of a continent's awakening. The story ended not with victory, not with peace, but with a question whispered across every street, every village, every border in Africa. Is this the day Africa began to rise? And for the first time in generations, the answer was not silence. It was a resounding, unstoppable yes.